with Ejaz Heather. Last Saturday, which was 5th June, Pakistan hosted the World Environment Day 2021 in partnership with the UN Environment Program. Prime Minister Imran Khan also penned an opinion piece for CNN, a US cable news network. He wrote about the degradation of urban environment as well as farmland, mentioned efforts being made to protect remaining natural treasures under the Bond Challenge 2020, listed the flora and fauna that needs to be protected, and stressed how absolutely vital it is to work on the triple planetary challenge of climate change, nature loss, and pollution. Khan also wrote, and I quote, Pakistan is presently working with international creditors on a debt for nature swap deal in which relief will be linked to achievements in biodiversity conservation. Pakistan also recently floated the country's first green bond amounting to $500 million, which was well received in the global market, unquote. To discuss what debt for nature swap means and what environmental challenges Pakistan faces, I'm joined by Dr. Erum Sattar, Program Lead Sustainable Water Management Program at Tufts. Dr. Sattar is a water law, policy and development expert joining us from Cambridge, Mass. And Dr. Waqar Ahmad, Economist and Joint Executive Director, Sustainable Policy Development Institute in Islamabad. Thank you to both my panelists. Here's what I propose. Let's first get the issue of debt for nature swap out of the way before we get to environmental challenges. And I say this because, let me see what I have here. The various types of debt for nature swap. There's a commercial debt for nature swap, which is also referred to as a three-party debt for nature swap. Then we have the bilateral debt for nature swaps, and we also have multilateral debt for nature swaps. But my bigger interest in this question, of course, in addition to trying to figure out how this thing works, is that they haven't really generated a lot of funding. For instance, the third-party debt for nature swaps have generated about $140 million from 1987 through to 2010, which, in my opinion, is not really enough. And then the multilateral debt for nature swaps, which involve a number of countries, again for the same period, have generated about $900 million. So let me pull in Dr. Waqar Ahmad on this. Waqar, of course, if you could sort of explain how this thing works. And secondly, what I said about it not having generated enough funds. So what are the chances that we could get something like this, which is in fact enough for us, in terms both of debt relief as well as funding for conservation?
Thank you, Ejaz Saab. And let me first of all start by congratulating you for taking this as a subject today. In fact, we were just discussing yesterday within our institute that how little attention this subject received, despite the fact that for a country like Pakistan to move into green financing in innovative manners, it's been a long time coming, something which should have been celebrated. But really grateful to you for having this subject on your program. Now, as I said, I think countries, almost all developing countries, are in search for new and innovative, creative financing instruments, those which are green and clean, of course, in their nature. And here is an opportunity, of course, and I do take your point that they may not have such innovative financial instruments linked to climate and environment, may not have raised a lot of money as yet. But this also, of course, comes back to how much market or what's the size of the green finance market yet, which of course is not as large as the conventional financial market. So as the size of the market grows and the interest of other economies, other developing economies grows, you're bound to see greater interest in debt to nature swaps as well as other sorts of financing. We also see that the trading regime in green financing is yet to come full circle. Of course, there have been recent talks about China, Pakistan integrating their carbon credit trading regime, but of course, this is still in the plans, but once this is through, then you could see the numbers pick up as well.
Right. Interesting. So that means that Pakistan will now approach UN bodies, or are we planning to approach bilaterally, the creditor countries? What exactly is the plan? Because Prime Minister's op-ed, from where I quoted this, does not really talk about how we're going to approach this.
For example, Ijaz, one of the bonds, with Indus bond, within the overall green bond category, has been offered to institutional investors. $500 million was raised at an interest rate of 7.5%. The bond was in fact oversubscribed, or an interest of around $3 billion came for the bond, but the project for which this was being raised was for WAPDA, for financing the construction of Damer and Bhasha dams, basically. And currently, of course, the financing need was only $500 million, which was raised. But in future, of course, if there are other projects, such as in renewable energy, in hydroelectric, which sort of promote our climate change agenda, now, of course, you will have a market for these bonds, given that government has come into this space now, and the regulator, which is SECP, has given a go-ahead.
Okay, now I think this is an excellent point at which to pull in Dr. Erum Sattar, the Indus bond. Dr. Erum Sattar has done a lot of work on Indus water basin and the areas, and also, since you mentioned the Ahmad Basha. So, Dr. Sattar, you have obviously, as I said, worked a lot on water resources, the issues of governance, not just the engineering side of things, but the overall sort of umbrella sort of concept, which is multidisciplinary and integrated. So, give us a sense of the challenge that we have in terms of being a water-stressed country, and any other related challenges with that you think need to be looked into as we move forward, considering, of course, that the Prime Minister seems to be quite eager, on sort of, the environmental issues. So what exactly the kind of infrastructure we have moving forward, and what exactly do we need to do to further these goals?
Thanks so much for this. So I think this has been already a really rich conversation at a pivotal moment in history. And that pivotal moment in history is important to capitalize, but it's important to capitalize in the right way. Let me remind your viewers that the idea of debt for nature swaps is not new. This, as you yourself put the figures, is a decades-old sort of, idea of how to try and move more sort of financing, more money into some kind of preservation, right, of our natural ecosystems. As you rightly pointed out, Pakistan's existential problem is its Indus River system. We have a growing population and we have a dwindling resource base. And every time you put higher demand and a dwindling resource base, you get into this X of a problem, right? Any economist will tell you that this is a serious problem because there will be resource scarcity, and then how will you solve those problems? We have not managed to do that yet. The problems in a federal country like Pakistan are sort of even more multiplied. Even if we go out and get some sort of these, some of these international commitments, we get financing to come to projects that we deem worthy, I think we have implementation challenges. And the reason, Ijaz, let me point out that this has been a problem, as is all green financing around the world, even in so-called developed countries, right? The issue is that how do you certify that these are actually outcomes that you have accomplished? Now, there's a lot of work on the international level. many different donors, including China, including the European Union, including the new Biden administration, are trying to come up with what will quantify regulatory frameworks that will give people certainty that what you're investing in for preservation of ecological systems is actually accomplishing something on the ground. There's issues of downtime, right? So there are many, many problems that have to be worked out, that are intellectual problems with the instruments themselves, which, as you say, the money that has flowed and the money that is likely to flow is limited. And I'm a skeptic. I think this is going to take years and years and years to get solved. So I think it's a problem. The other thing is Pakistan has these acute issues. It's sort of like an emergency. And if we don't start taking it very, very seriously, up to a third of the Himalayan glaciers, for which we basically rely for 60% of our water supply in our river systems annually, may actually disappear if global temperature rises occur as they are predicted to, right? So on the 2050 trajectory and then on the 2100, so half century mark and then the 80 years to the end of the century, the turn of century, Pakistan's problems are critical. I'm just not sure that the kinds of monies that will be required for these efforts to happen can be unlocked. They can be tapped. International financial markets, green financing can be tapped, but it's certainly not going to get us anywhere close. One other thing, if I may, I would like to put on the table for discussion is that how a country has to think about it is, and by the way, these are also questions that are being asked internationally, right? So how much are you subsidizing what are traditionally, even if you look at the Prime Minister's op-ed, right? He talks about, more building is happening, more agricultural lands are being taken out of circulation. All of that is correct, right? But Pakistan's growth strategy right now, how to grow out of this is to say, well, let's subsidize the construction sector. And the construction sector will obviously build over land. Our implementation of green building standards is minimal, to say the least. So what countries internationally are asking is, well, how much are you, country X, who's now coming for these monies to us, how much are you subsidizing what are the industries that are in fact going to act as the countervailing forces of these green investments, right? So if you go into the international sort of markets, you have to have a credible story of, why are we doing development in a sustainable way? And meanwhile, these things are not counter sort of acting each other, these forces.
Absolutely brilliant points. Let me pull in Dr. Waqar on this. Dr. Waqar, Dr. Sattar is saying, essentially the various points that she's made boil down to a single fact, which is that whatever planning that we need to do going forward has to be integrated. There's also the issue that there's, of course, the science of the environment, and lots of things we already know. But then we also have the politics. Now, for instance, and this is something on which I'm going to go back to Dr. Sattar, so I just want to park it here. The issue of the upper and lower riparian, whether we can find a framework where the interests of the upper and lower riparian can be put in a cooperative framework. Indeed, what I'm saying is whether we can actually get out of this binary of the upper and lower riparian and think in terms of some kind of cooperative framework. So, Waqar, the issue of integrated planning now, STPI has been focusing on this for a long time, in more than 2 decades now. What do you see on the ground in terms of policy planning, in terms of an integrated approach that actually underpins sustainable development?
Thank you, Jasif. I think let me first of all agree with what Dr. Sattar said. And you cannot have 1 or 2 projects being floated in the international market saying that these would be clean and green projects and for which we want to raise funding. But yet you'll have the entire production system or structure in the country or the growth strategy of a country which does not follow the same ethos, basically the clean production system. So if you don't have sustainable consumption and sustainable production as the underlying sort of plan, you can't sort of convince the investors, long-term investors, in your green agenda, if I can use the words. And this essentially brings me to your point, which is the need for integrated planning, something which we have been advocating for ages. First of all, you need to, of course, sit down, not just at the federal level, but of course with all the provinces, and have a bottom-up discussion this time. The days of top-down planning are gone, and a bottom-up discussion is now required with regards to where do we want to take these production structures, how we have to reform these production structures in a manner that they don't further deteriorate our environment. Climate change concerns have to be addressed. We have issues linked to food security, of course, which are sort of exacerbated by the environmental pressures as well. That's one. Second is, once the planning system delivers an integrated plan, then, of course, these plans have to be backed by budgets. So that's the second main issue, that planning and budgeting is not in sync with each other at this very point, And once you put your budget into something, then, of course, things have to be monitored. So even those projects which we are starting, and of course, while I wish this project which has raised $500 million in green bond, I wish them all the luck, but our past track of completing projects or debt finance projects is not that very good. We know that most of these projects do run into time and cost overruns, due to which eventually the cost escalates. And then the investor, of course, asks us that what is the guarantee of the return on their investment, So you don't want to come out paying higher amounts of premium, which to me, as in my very independent opinion, I think the reason that this time around the green bond was very lucrative for the international investors, because you were actually paying an interest rate which was much higher than what the peer economies or the peer instruments were offering. So if the average going interest rate for a competing green bond-like instrument would be around 4 to 4.5%, you actually offered a 7.5% rate, which is why the bond was lucrative.
Okay. So, Dr. Sattar, as I said, the idea of a cooperative framework, because it's not just about engineering, it's also not just about rationality, frankly. And I say it as someone who's looked at politics for a long time. So there are other issues that come into the way of purely rational thinking. So how does one go into that cooperative framework where, for instance, there is no blame game in this particular case, let's say, between Punjab and Sindh?
Fascinating. As you know, this is what I work on, right? The problems here are extensive. They have long histories. And as you know, the economists of old used to call it political economy for a reason, right? That human beings are not just rational actors, that we have all kinds of emotions. Behavioral economics will now tell you this. Also, there are now, in our case, there's these long histories, right? The British set up our economic model in a particular way. And whether we like it or not, water flows down, right? So water access in terms of location is a fight around the world. Now, can the upper and the lower riparians in Pakistan get out of this competitive, sort of problem, right? One, I win, so you lose, right? That sort of mindset, can it be gotten out of? Yes. But it takes an enormous amount of institutional building. And I would just build on one thing that Dr. Ahmad said, that this, yes, you need the economics worked out, but you also need institutional capacity. And in a fragmented country, you need a lot of implementation capacity on the ground, also within our institutions. So what is the human sort of capital that is going to undertake such projects, right? And do we know that we have the right people with the right mindset and the right capacities to coordinate at the local, provincial, etc. level? I mean, as a follower of this issue, right now, as we know, our Water Accord of 1991, which does interprovincial water sharing, is basically a subject of massive controversy in the country, right? I mean, there are speeches in all kinds of assemblies. This is, your top of mind political issue at the moment. Now, the one problem that Pakistan has is that we always behave as if we're the only country that has to manage a water system or a river system and has upstream, downstream issues. We don't. Countries around the world, within their borders and with across borders, deal with this. There are certainly things that we can do to lower the temperature, lower the pressure, but that fundamental realization that we are overcommitting in terms of what we are putting in and what we're getting out of the current structure of the water economy, I think has to be a starting point for any kind of move away that says, no, there is another way to build this economy. There is another way to do human development. It doesn't need to be done in these terms. What that means is about 90 to 95% of fresh water is being used to produce a very small, relatively percentage of sort of the development or the GDP of the country. So this has to be rationalized in some way, right? We have to build in efficiencies into the system so that it's not one province against the other, which is a long-standing problem. As I said, it has colonial antecedents, and this is a problem. The last thing that I would just sort of like to say on this is that while we can solve these problems, it needs a lot of goodwill. And as Dr. Ahmad was also pointing out, it needs an empowerment of smaller communities who will be the custodians of particular projects, for instance, right? Who are the gainers? Who are the losers? And we have to have a serious conversation about that in the country. At the moment, I'm not sure we're having this. And what I think we should also sort of fundamentally believe is that accepting that the only way to preserve our ecosystems, our resources, our land and water base is to get some foreign funder to either do debt forgiveness or so that we can raise financing in these international markets, as Dr. Ahmad said, at a huge premium, right? It's very, very expensive. Germany just raised money on its green bonds. That's not a comparable economy. But the point is, these are at 1% or lower premium is what other countries are, in fact, raising billions of dollars. So, we are paying investors. I mean, it's very lucrative if you're an investor and this is what you want to say you're doing. I mean, it's very profitable. So it makes sense for us. So what we need to think about is, are there reasons that Pakistan wants to do this for reasons that are not just monetizable, that are not just countable in economic terms, right? Is there such a concern of value for nature that comes from somewhere else? Are there ethical considerations to put on the table? I think there is the need for a very mature conversation that also gets us out of this purely market-based, neoliberal sort of, mindset that says the only way you preserve resources is if you count them in economic terms. And I suggest that there are countries that are saying, no, that's not necessarily the case. There are other and better reasons for why you must act to preserve the very land and water on which you rely.
Yeah, that's the conversation that the economists are also having. I mean, the entire idea of whether the Friedmanite economics is something that we need moving forward. And I wish we could have a discussion on that, but I'm not an economist myself, so I'm not going to stick my neck out. But Dr. Waqar Ahmad, Dr. Sattar has, again, put some very important points on the table. We will, for the moment, not really go into the ethical and other issues because time is very short. But with reference to funding and with reference to waiting for foreign funders, as I pointed out in my opening also, that this hasn't really generated a lot of money. What exactly can we do, assuming that we're very serious about this? And I think we are at one level, yes, at least in theory we are. I've spoken to some people, I'm sure you speak with people all the time with reference to sustainable development. There is a sense that we need to do this. But then, of course, there is the issue of implementation also, to which Dr. Sattar, referred to earlier in her remarks. So, 1, 2, 3, the prescriptive side of it, what exactly can we do in order to sort of generate our own funds also? And as you mentioned yourself, a bottom-up approach involving communities.
So, Ijaz, as you rightly said, the first thing is, of course, for any funder, show me the money is the first thing. So they need to see the return basically to start with, and which is what you have already shown by, of course, offering a much higher interest rate than the peer instruments. But now, of course, we understand that their interest is there, but the next part is slightly more difficult, that you have to improve the implementation side of things. As your track record in implementing green projects becomes better, you will be in a position to bring down this cost of capital. And multilaterals, bilaterals, or commercial funders, at one point or the other, all of them treat the loan arrangements the same. The interest rates may vary. One of them may end up giving you a concessional rate, but the terms or the conditions tied to that interest rate usually remain the same. Nobody's going to come around and give us grant instead of a loan. So the loan eventually becomes a national level sovereign obligation, which can only, of course, be delivered if our project implementation apparatus becomes much more efficient, and international investors over time see us as an economy that delivers on these projects in a timely and of course, cost-efficient manner. That's number 2. Third, of course, is to become part of regional arrangements. As I said, we have a lot of learning from China in this aspect, and given that Chinese have already created a large market for green financing, and one of that is the green bonds market, I think that is where we need to integrate. You could have several variants of these bonds, which could be launched in regional markets.
Waqar, let me interject here. This is, of course, not. This is sort of not just a reference to what the Chinese have done with green financing, but I don't think China is an example that we should use, given the kind of system that they have and the way they go about making policy and even more so implementing it, which I don't think we either have the tools for that or that kind of implementation is even desirable.
Fully agreed, Ijaz Sahab, and I think nobody would counter that. China is, of course, one of the biggest polluters, and that is something, of course, which they should be accountable towards. But having said this, I was only talking strictly in terms of finance and markets, and the fact that they will, currently as well as in the medium term, they will remain the largest investors in green financing, which of course becomes the market for us to tap, for other developing countries to tap as well.
Okay, I have to wrap up also, so let me quickly go back to Dr. Erum Sattar on this. So Dr. Sattar, any final words? And also, of course, without prejudice to what Dr. Waqar has been saying, well, one thing is very clear that, and I say this also as a student of social sciences myself, we all have our silos in which we move. We use our disciplines, theoretical frameworks. So at the end of the day, the economist is going to look at more in terms of capital, in terms of financing. The engineer is going to bring to the table engineering solutions. The lawyer is going to talk about the legal framework, and so on and so forth. So perhaps, I don't even know if it's possible, but we need to get people from various disciplines to sort of, bounce ideas off each other and get out of their respective silos. I'm not even sure if that's possible, frankly, but, one can give it a try.
I couldn't agree with you more. What I have always worked on, what I've been trained on through a process that says, look, multidisciplinarity is not only the present, the future, it's absolutely the right approach for the world's problems, right? No one discipline has a final lock on looking at a problem and saying, no, we've got it, this is right. Everyone will bring something else to the table. And I think you point out something that we really lack. If you look at the people who are involved with a lot of our development sectors, especially within water sector planning and development, are basically all, some kind of civil engineers, right? I mean, for the most part, that's true. That's their backgrounding. So they don't have anthropological study. They don't have, lawyers at the table, right? So I think one of the things that we could really hope for is Pakistan, while it's going out for all of this green financing, also starts to think about, well, what's the human development capacity that we need within the country to train and bring in people from multiple disciplines to look at this problem, train this together. I think our universities have a big role to play, and I hope that our universities can also be involved in this sort of project of national development that taps people's capacities and then says, well, what do you bring to the table and what do you bring to the table? And then let's look at this problem together. I think that is the need of the hour. So if we can utilize some of these fundings to sort of also unlock the kinds of human development and training capacities that we need within country, that would be a serious long-term intellectual win.
I suspect that we'll have more occasions to talk about this, but this has been very enlightening. Thank you so much, Dr. Erum Sattar. Thank you to Dr. Waqar Ahmad for their insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the second incident of seizure of uranium in India in less than a month. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Last Friday, police in India arrested 7 people and seized 6.4 kg of uranium from their possession. This marks the second time in less than a month that authorities in India captured a large quantity of the radioactive material from unauthorized persons in that country. The next day, at a daily briefing, Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Zahid Hafiz expressed serious concern over the incident. Hafiz noted that there is a need for thorough investigation of the matter as to how such sizable quantity of uranium could become available outside any state control and identify the gaps which made this possible. It's important to note that Pakistan did not raise the matter with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the United Nations nuclear watchdog, because it has been Pakistan's policy that security of nuclear material is a national responsibility. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Dr. Adil Sultan, former Air Commodore and currently Dean of Social Sciences at the Air University, and Ali Sultan, a lawyer and international law expert. And on a lighter note, let me just say that Adil Sultan and Ali Sultan are not related, but of course they share the same surname. Let me begin with Dr. Sultan here. Dr. Sultan, give me your view of as I said in my opening, our policy is that we're not going to raise the matter with the IAEA, but we have definitely asked for a thorough investigation. So moving forward from here, what else can we do, given also the fact that any number of members of the nuclear supplier group have been wanting to get India into the NSG. So perhaps we still need to agitate the issue of lax, controls within India and sort of get the spotlight of other countries into Indian practices?
Any country which has nuclear material or facilities, these things can happen. But what is worrying is if the frequency increases too much. And as you said, within a month, a second episode of attempted nuclear smuggling, then it indicates that probably there is a black market prevalent over there, and there is a racket, and there is a supply and demand both. So that's the issue, that where this material is being taken to. The second point that you said about Pakistan has not or is not raising this issue with the IAEA because, as we all understand, nuclear security remains a national responsibility. But then the countries that have nuclear material and facilities, they have international obligations also. If Pakistan is not raising this issue, the IAEA must inquire from India the sources and where this material was going and the safety and security standards. The reason why I'm saying is that India is a signatory to the Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, including its amendment also. What the CPPNM does is that it makes it obligatory for all countries to ensure safety and security of their nuclear facilities, domestic facilities. Earlier it was about international transportation, but after this amendment came into force, so all the countries which have signed this, they have obligation to ensure that. And some of the elements of that CPPNM is to strengthen cooperation, to share that information with other countries in case there is an incident of nuclear smuggling or illicit trafficking. So whether Pakistan raises or not, India has an obligation to report to the IAEA, to report to the Incident and Trafficking Database, ITDB, where the Interpol also works, and they also collect such information. So we are not sure if these international agencies are asking India or not, but they must ask as per the international obligations.
Absolutely. I think one of the points that you've raised, we think is very, very important with reference to further investigation into this, has to do with the fact that this is the second incident in less than a span of 1 month. So clearly, there is a supplier somewhere, and clearly there is a buyer somewhere, and clearly there's a network that's working. And I think that is where India needs to further investigate this. And as you said, if it's a signatory to the treaty, then it must also inform the other members of what it is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, these are two episodes where material was apprehended. We don't know how many incidents or how many attempted smuggling incidents that would go unnoticed. There could be significant quantity where the state entities or the non-state entities could have been transporting this material or uranium. And then there is also an important point that there are several countries which have entered into nuclear cooperation agreement with India, and they are supplying national uranium to India. For instance, Australia supplied in 2017 uranium ore to India as part of their agreement. Now it's obligatory for Australia to also demand where this nuclear material is being proliferated from India, because they are also supplier and they would be held accountable as per their Article 1 NPT obligation. So the countries which are supplying this material and equipment, they must ask, including the nuclear suppliers group. Several of the nuclear suppliers group member countries, they have nuclear cooperation with India. It would be legitimate for them to ask or demand this explanation why this material is being proliferated from India, which is supposed to be having an impeccable non-proliferation record.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Adil Sultan, former Air Commodore, speaking with us. Let me pull in Ali Sultan on this. Ali, give me your perspective on this, the international law perspective on what's happening and what are India's obligations, and how can Pakistan be, effective in terms of, letting the rest of the world know that this is what's happening in India?
First of all, let me just say that I fully endorse what Dr. Adil Sultan was mentioning in terms of India's international law obligations, especially under this multilateral treaty called the Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, as well as its amendment. And since India is a party to that treaty, and as Adil Sahab mentioned, it has certain obligations under that treaty when incidents of this kind occur, including voluntarily reporting them to IAEA and other countries, so that the matter can be handled more effectively. Now, that's one layer of international law obligations which is applicable on India. There is another set of international law obligations emanating from the Security Council resolutions 1540, which was passed in 2004, under which again India has obligations not just to the treaty parties of CPPNM, but to the rest of the world, to the entire world, which includes all the UN members. And under those obligations, India is supposed to have strict and efficient and effective controls and regulatory and administrative and legal measures in place so that incidents like these don't happen. Now, I should also like to add that in addition to these recent two incidents, in the last 5 or 6 years, especially during the Obama presidency, there were similar incidents of uranium and other radioactive material theft in India. And constantly, in multiple reports by a very respectable think tank on nuclear affairs called the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which was actually founded by Ted Turner. And they come up with these ranking of security mechanisms in all the countries which have radioactive material. And India consistently ranks right at the bottom, just above North Korea in those rankings. So this is not a new problem. It's been there for a while, and concerns were expressed, at least privately, in the Obama administration about this. So maybe Washington, now that we have Biden in Washington, who at the time was the vice president in the Obama administration, would like to take this more seriously, because we need to remember that this is not a matter of purely Indian concern or a regional concern, but this is a matter of global concern. I'd like to add that also the Financial Action Task Force also has a framework on proliferation financing, and India is up for a review before the FATF later this year. So the FATF members should look into this very scrupulously and hold India to book for this lax in their regulatory as well as legal regimes.
Now, this FATF point is very important. I'm also happy that you talked about the NTI ranking. And Pakistan, of course, is much higher than India in the NTI rankings. Thank you so much. That was Ali Sultan speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.